Hello everybody. As Ben said, my name's Richard Newton, and I'm hoping this presentation is going to follow on nicely from Shannon's present well. I'm the Sunshine Coast Council's ecologist. I sit in the Environment and Sustainability Policy branch within Council, and I'm responsible for biodiversity network planning. I'm also one of the project leads for the Environment Levy Land Acquisition Program, which has recently purchased a number of properties in the Pumicestone Passage catchment, adding to Council's Environment Reserve network. And I'm pleased to be here today to talk about Council's habitat mapping and how it relates to the Pumicestone Passage conservation management outcomes. In 2017, Council developed the Environment and Livability Strategy, which sets the strategic direction for protecting and managing our natural assets. The ELS includes 4 natural environment themes. Each theme has a set of policy positions, guiding principles, targets and associated transformational actions. One of the transformational actions is to build our knowledge through monitoring, research and other data collection. To support the biodiversity theme, Council committed to producing a biodiversity report every 3 to 4 years, which reports on a range of biodiversity indicators, including the extent and distribution of the local government's native vegetation and habitat areas. This was a key driver for Council to develop its own finer scale vegetation mapping. But before I get into the mapping, I just wanted to provide a snapshot of the Pumicestone Passage catchment taken from the 2020 Biodiversity Report, which was released at the end of last year. You can obtain a full report, including the technical background report, from Council's website. As you can see from this slide, the extent of the Pumicestone Passage catchment area that occurs within the Sunshine Coast local government area. And this is a bit of a challenge that we have to sort of co-manage this with Moreton. So it's really important that those relationships are formed and built on in terms of having that overarching management for the entire catchment. The portion that sits within the Sunshine Coast local government area, it's about 60% of the catchment, or 45,755 hectares. Of that area, 38% is covered in native vegetation. Roughly 3/4 of it is remnant vegetation and the other quarter is non-remnant vegetation. So it's interesting to sort of look at those stats in relation to what Shannon was talking about in terms of the whole catchment before. It's comprised of 38 regional ecosystems, including coastal, foreshore, mangrove, salt marsh, heath and wallum, melaleuca and casuarina, eucalypt and rainforest vegetation communities. And 80% of those vegetation communities are made up of eucalypt and melaleuca. 15% of the catchment is in conservation, and conservation is made up of protected areas as well as voluntary conservation areas. So it's made up of national parks and conservation parks, council environment reserves, nature refuges, voluntary conservation agreements and land for wildlife properties. Or you could look at it in terms of being 41% of the remaining native vegetation that's in conservation. There are 38 animal and 24 plant species listed under the Commonwealth's Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and the State's Nature Conservation Act, listed as vulnerable, endangered or critically endangered. Moving on to the development of our habitat mapping, aerial laser surveys or LiDAR technology was used to assist in the development of localised vegetation mapping. LiDAR capture was commissioned by the Sunshine Coast Council first in 2009, just post the Queensland local government amalgamations. Again in 2014, just after the de-amalgamation of Noosa, and a third capture recently in 2018. These LiDAR runs, Council is able to convert the data into a finer scale native vegetation mapping layer. This data is also known as our non-remnant vegetation data set. As you can see on the screen, Council's non-remnant data set, that first slide, was combined with the state's remnant regional ecosystem data set to create what we refer to as a foundational layer of native vegetation. This foundational native vegetation layer underpins and forms the basis for the development of Council's habitat mapping. Council's habitat mapping is driven by a landscape ecology approach which seeks to understand the vegetation at that whole of landscape scale, to understand the relationships within and between habitat areas where potential corridors may exist and could be enhanced, and how fragmentation is impacting on the network. Knowledge and understanding of habitat areas at that landscape scale is vital to ensure the best planning outcomes for ecological functionality, connectivity, species viability can be achieved. And to this end, Council determined that the use of a GIS fragmentation model would be the most appropriate method to assist in identifying our habitat areas within that native vegetation dataset. This type of spatial software gives you the capacity to attribute and analyse a multitude of habitat and vegetation features. Fragmentation models used to characterise vegetation is an accepted method used by biodiversity conservation organisations and governments around the world. This particular map, hopefully you can see that clearly on the big screen, is the Pumicestone Passage, the section that occurs in the Sunshine Coast local government area, and it shows the results of that applied fragmentation model to the native vegetation data set, and it effectively identifies 3 broad habitat classes. The first is in the dark green areas. They're our core habitat areas, which are defined by 50 hectares or greater of consolidated native vegetation, and an internal buffer of 50 metres has been applied. The second class of habitat is the lime green colour, and this vegetation remains connected to the core habitat areas but has fallen below that 50 metre buffer width and subsequently identified as contiguous core habitat areas. This habitat is still considered a part of the core, but has obviously been modified and impacted to a point where there's possible compromise to that connection. This is powerful information to know when identifying areas to improve ecological connectivity or habitat consolidation, deriving revegetation and restoration plans. The third class of habitat is the grey area, all the remaining veg. It's effectively the balance of all the vegetation that occurs in the catchment, and it's been further classed into smaller patch sizes, which is all referred to as connecting habitat areas, and I'll touch on that in an upcoming slide. The Pumicestone Passage catchment includes 37 whole or part core habitat areas, and to put that into context, the entire local government area has 165 core habitat areas. 37 core habitat areas, which comprises pretty much 2/3 of the total native vegetation extent that occurs within this part of the catchment. This slide shows an example of that relationship between the core habitat areas and that associated contiguous core habitat areas. You can see here on the inset image where the tendrils of vegetation extend from that main core but have narrowed below that defined buffer width. Not all cores have this associated contiguous core habitat areas. There are 24 of the catchment's 37 core habitat areas that have the associated contiguous veg, but there's 13 that don't. And generally, for the cores that do not have that associated contiguous vegetation, we would infer that that has a greater level of fragmentation and isolation in the landscape. There are a number of cores in the catchment that are physically connected by that contiguous core habitat veg. This slide shows the example of the various sizes of connecting habitat areas. They have been grouped in descending patch sizes. Really, this is like a patch size analysis tool as well. You can see the darker brown area there falls into the 49 to 25 hectare patch size. The mustard colour patches fall between 24 and 10 hectares. The yellow ones are the 9 to 1 hectare, and all the magenta colour is all the remaining patches that fall below that 1 hectare in area. The connecting habitat areas are made up of more than 65,000 patches in the data set, or polygons if you like, which amounts to about 35,400 hectares of native veg. That's quite amazing when you consider that there's 165 core areas throughout the region, yet there's 65,000 patches that fall below that size. So that's sort of indicating that the landscape is, reasonably fragmented. There's more than 64,000 patches, or 98% of that connecting habitat, that falls below 10 hectares in area. once again, just reinforcing that idea that it's, quite a fragmented and isolated landscape in areas. In summary, so the Pumicestone Passage catchment, while the catchment does maintain a number of mid-sized and smaller core habitat areas, it is considered to be moderately to highly fragmented. Ecological functionality is maintained in areas largely due to the associated land uses of forestry. So as Shannon was touching on earlier, it's really important what happens with those state forest areas moving forwards in terms of the mix of that broader habitat area. So moving forward, what are we doing with this information, and how are we going to use it? So we're currently developing a dashboard that consolidates a range of environmental data sets with the core habitat areas. So we can start to characterise each core and infer levels of ecological functionality. As you can see from the screenshot, we're using a range of environmental data sets. As I mentioned, we're using Commonwealth and state listed flora and fauna records. We're using the regional ecosystem data. We're using the Commonwealth's threatened ecological community data. We've done a lot of work at our own local level to determine what are locally poorly conserved regional ecosystems. And just to sort of touch on something earlier that Shannon was talking about, that percentage ratio, when we consider how much is in protection, is actually a percentage of the pre-clear extent, correct me if I'm wrong, Shannon, and not so much the extent that remains of that particular ecosystem type. So typically 4% of what remains is not actually 4% of what did occur. So it's a bit of a technical part of that. But we're also using waterways and wetlands info in the dashboard, the conservation estate, protected areas, land use, and a whole stack of other data that can be distilled into these geo databases. And they're really powerful because pretty much anyone can use it and can click on an area and understand what's going on in that area. Just to use a bit of a Pumicestone Passage example, drilling down, this particular example that I pulled out is in the Beerburrum area. It's the 16th largest core. That particular core has a total area of 668.4 hectares. It's almost entirely made up of remnant regional ecosystem vegetation, and it's largely protected in a national park tenure. This core also contains Mount Beerburrum and Mount Tibrogargan Glasshouse Mountains, a number of threatened species, and a couple of fauna records as well. And so this system has the capacity to build on that information as it becomes available. So when new records are identified, it can be uploaded into the system, and then it's reflected on the dashboard for those particular cores. So we can start to see consolidating this information in these ways gives us the capacity to interrogate a whole range of features. It becomes a really powerful tool for planning and driving management outcomes. For us, it's helping us to understand ecological connectivity and functionality within the Northern Pumicestone. It also assists us in our biodiversity and waterways network and conservation planning, and helps to inform our environment levy land acquisition program. So thank you for listening. That's the end of my presentation, and I'll look forward to answering any questions in the morning.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have got one question for you. Whoops. How does council have east-west corridors with an expanded roads and rail, also with population nodes in these areas? I guess the question's asking you to reconcile that.
Yeah, well, how do we address it collectively? Not just as a council, but I think Shannon touched on that earlier as well. And I think through planning, we have to achieve better outcomes for those particular linear infrastructure impediments, and start to build in more ecological connectivity into that infrastructure. I know that, for example, the state's Department for Main Roads, they're looking at revamping one of their key manuals that they use to help define the actual designs of some of these areas. So we're looking to get some positive outcomes through that process. But yeah, look, it's a big question, an important question. I don't think it's can be really addressed just by council. I think all the players involved in planning and development and conservation management have to work together to achieve those outcomes.
So the question is, what can a ordinary person do about that issue?
Well, in terms of improving and maintaining connectivity for fauna species, I don't know where your particular house is located, if it's in an urban area or whether it's in a peri-urban area or whether it's in a rural area, but certainly you can undertake activities on your property to enhance the capacity for fauna to move through that property or to use that property for connectivity between habitats.
All right, thank you, Richard.